Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the RTS podcast. We are returning once again on a pretty good pace, actually. This is about one podcast every 2 weeks, so I'm happy with that. Today, I'm very excited to be finally talking to Wayward strategy, Mr. Brandon Castile. He's a bit of a big deal in the RTS sphere. He has his own blog. He rants a lot about RTS design and reviews. And so we were just saying this before we started the video, but this is rather overdue, shall we say. I sent Brandon a DM on Twitter in June 2015, being like, "Hey man, hey, want to talk on a podcast?" And he was like, "Yeah, sure thing." And April 2018, we're finally doing it. So this is going to be exciting. And joining me is the Company of Heroes 2 Shoutcaster. I'm trying to think what else is in his bio. Something about making tutorial videos. Mr. Tightrope.
Yes. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me along, Callum.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be here myself. It's with three kids, it can be hard to schedule time. So I'm glad we finally made it happen.
Yeah. So the normal guy who co-hosts the season 2 of this podcast, Milter, he's a startup colleague of mine, really good guy to talk to, but it's currently about 2 a.m. in Denmark, so he couldn't quite make this one, unfortunately.
Makes sense.
Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about today's topic. So I'll let Brandon introduce this because he's the one that coined this term. What I've noticed of Brandon's writings is that he has a lot of really fancy sounding terms that he likes to use. So what is it we're talking about today, Brandon?
Well, so I just try to be really precise and I consider myself kind of like an American primitive in terms of game design and the philosophy of how strategy games are put together. So yeah, I do tend to kind of coin my own terms for things. And this isn't something I think that will surprise anybody once we get talking about it, but I've been thinking a lot about the impact of what I call experientially different units, which is basically units that you have to think about and treat differently. I've been playing a little bit of Forged Battalion recently, and that's one of the core issues with the game, I think, is that all of the units, you can build them yourself and you can design, put these components together to make custom units, but they all kind of feel the same. You all treat them all the same. There are some exceptions, but it's very different from something like StarCraft, where a siege tank feels, you use it completely differently, you think about it differently than a Zergling, obviously, or a Widow Mine and a Banshee. And you can use Banshees and Widow Mines both to harass all lines, but the approach, both in terms of thinking about it, reacting to it, and executing it, is all very different. And I guess recently I was just thinking about how that impacts the design of the faction and the importance of having different types of thing to think about in terms of combat encounters.
So in layman terms, you're saying how do RTS games make units feel different?
Yeah.
In a rather visceral sense, which is something that many RTS games do brilliantly. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk to Tightrope today is because he's a strong figure in the Company of Heroes community. And Company of Heroes is a franchise that has done this spectacularly. In fact, really all of Relic's games have done so.
Relic and Blizzard, I think, both are pretty much the top of the heap in terms of this.
Well, I would definitely also say Command and Conquer. I think even, if not the best example, certainly one of them is Command and Conquer 3. The way that you have, for example, attack bikes, tanks, aircraft, all different types of the alien units, the epic units that you get. I think CNC3 does it really well, and it means that controlling each of those units is differently. But I do want to ask you a little bit more about Forged Battalion, because I've never actually played it. How does the unit builder work?
So typically when I think, and I'm dating myself a little bit talking about this, but Earth 2150, that you kind of had this in-match tech tree, and you research things, and you got your chassis and your weapons and your treads, and you kind of combine those things to make units. And that's kind of how Forged Battalion works, except it all happens outside of combat. So in Forge Battalion, when you fight a match, you gain points, and you spend those points in a meta level tech tree. So you unlock different types of ballistic weapons, and you unlock different types of armor modifications and movement style modifications, and you put them together. You pick a weapon, you pick infantry, light vehicle, heavy vehicle, or aircraft, and you can put regenerative armor, stealth, radiation shielding, heat shielding. And when the game launched, the different armor options were really, really bad. Like there was no reason to ever do like chemical shielding or radiation shielding, because you had a really low chance of running into that. What they did about a month or two after launch is they started adding in some modifications to that, where like when a unit with chemical armor dies, it leaves behind a cloud of poison gas that hurts you nearby, or units with heat shielding do a light AoE around themselves. So that's starting to build up the feeling of, okay, I've got to think about my units a little differently, and it actually matters, maybe to try to put heat shielding on it. It could actually impact my strategy instead of just, cross my fingers my opponent has a unit with a flamethrower.
Right. So where does Forge Battalion go wrong?
So first off, I feel like that the entire idea of the meta tech tree, like you have to earn the points to unlock the various things. And the way it works is you can only slot 4 unit types into a building type. So you can only ever bring 4 different types of infantry to combat. And obviously, as you make a more complex infantry, so like let's say I give it a healing weapon and heavy armor, and I give it the jump jets. It's going to be a tier 3 unit, which means you need to build the tech building and then the super weapon to actually unlock that unit. Where if you just stick the healer weapon on it and don't give it any armor, don't give it any advanced movement options, it's going to be a tier 1, and then you can access it right as soon as you first build the barracks. So first off, so you can only bring 4 of each different type of unit, and that's already cutting down on your options. And if you want some tier 1 and some tier 2, you're really kind of picking and choosing for each unit what it can do, and you're leaving out vast pieces of the tech tree anyway. So why force people to play all these matches to earn the unlocks if you're already limiting what they can do? And I think there was a pretty big backlash about that when they launched it, and they sped up the rate at which you gain stuff, but it's still a little annoying to play 4 or 5 skirmishes to be able to unlock the nuke or something.
Yeah, I think any RTS game that has meta progression is really hard to do. Like Dawn of War 3 had that, and that they ended up completely reverting it.
And honestly, I thought the system was pretty darn good after they dropped the whole skulls thing. I thought that, and they gave you access to basically everything up front. I think that was a really good idea for them. But yeah, it's really, really hard to do well. I think the current system, and it took them a long time to work that out too. Company of Heroes too, I think is one of the friendlier approaches I've seen now that they, a couple of years ago, switched over to the
War Spoils.
Supply.
Yeah, supply. Yeah. That seems like a pretty fair system, even if the bulletins just never really impressed me. At least you can do something with it now.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the Dawn of War 3 progression is that it basically punishes you for trying to swap factions or even just swapping strategies. So, and I think the problem when it comes to that meta progression is you either have two cases. You have Company of Heroes who bulletins, which are just insignificant. It's like 2% bonus accuracy, 3% build speed. Like, well, this is just meaningless. And then in Dawn of War 3, you have, oh, by the way, your Devastators now slow enemy targets. Oh, by the way, your scouts now have these grenades. You have these massive, huge, powerful bonuses. And the way that the system would work is you would pick one unit, and you would make that unit broken. So you go, okay, well, I'm going to give 3 upgrades to my Devastators. I'm going to spam Devastators. I see you're going to spam TAC Marines. So it really limited the strategic diversity, and it made it harder to then try to swap different things because you have to unlock all those stuff. Especially, you know, when you're trying to play a different faction, and then you don't have any of the elites that you want. But I mean, that's getting a little bit off topic, but it is an interesting place to talk about. But Tightrope, how do you think Company of Heroes 2 makes all of the different unit types feel fun to use and feel different and have that experiential component of like, okay, this is a tank, this is infantry?
I think they're kind of lucky because they've got such good source material. They don't really have to invent that much. Everything's based real units. They are in real life, and then that also transfers into the game where you see like a big tank, you know, oh man, that must be really strong, or maybe, you know, doesn't have a turret, so this is very specialized, you know, like unit. It can only shoot forward, so that forward shooting gun must be extremely powerful. And they're just they've struck a gold mine there. I think not having to invent these things makes it easy for the players to jump in, and a great feel for that straight away.
Yeah, I think the word you're looking for was visually intuitive. Is that you you see a tank, you're like, oh, I know what a tank does. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that certainly helps, and that's part of the reason why history games always have that advantage, especially something like World War II, where you naturally have a greater variance of what things look like. Whereas if you take a medieval combat, like what's the difference between a guy with a sword, the guy with a spear? Like, I mean, some people will know that sort of stuff historically, but most people will look at that and don't really know it intuitively.
Yeah.
I think what makes Company of Heroes work so well is just the different sort of movement patterns. So there's different types of movement. So for example, you know, you have infantry, they're going to, I mean, Company of Heroes 1 did this more than number 2, but infantry will sort of move a little bit sporadically, like the weave from cover to cover. They will automatically take cover behind things. They don't all walk simultaneously. Like some of them stagger a little bit to sort of make it look like they're less uniform, which is actually something that Dawn of War 3 didn't do. In Dawn of War 3, whenever you would get a squad of like say TAC Marines, and you would select them and you would right click and you would go over there, they all completely start doing the exact same animation at the exact same time, and it looks really stiff and really robotic. Whereas Dawn of War 2 before that, Company of Heroes, the units, they sort of staggered in a way, and they would have multiple variances of their animation. So some, like the default animation, they would just run forward, but then some of them would sort of like look around. Some of them may like touch their weapon or something. So they had these little looping animations that gave them life. And then when you compare them to vehicles, you know, vehicles have acceleration and deceleration, which infantry do not. Tanks, they can't turn on the spot. Tanks can crush cover, but it also depends on the type of it. So a scout car can't crush cover, and then say a Panzer IV can, but then Tiger has heavy crush. So there's different types of crush that give it this visceral power, because you see it like crushing roadblocks and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that the way I think about it is like with Company of Heroes, Company of Heroes 2, you have these basic rules of how things move and how things interact, and the infantry handle them differently than vehicles. And like Tightrope said, it makes perfect sense when you look at it. But from a design perspective, you know, you think about cover completely differently when you're moving an infantry squad than when you're moving that Panzer IV. You know, tanks, like you said, they crush cover. They don't have to worry about getting any bonuses from it. You know, a building is an obstacle to a tank or a target, where with an infantry, it's a way to protect them. Even if there's the danger component of, you know, oh, I could take a tank shell, or I could take a grenade and lose most of my squad.
A demo, more like.
Yeah. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about when I say experientially. And I think you both made a great point that more than that, one of the things that Relic has historically done really well is giving you visual cues to all that. And you have, with the World War II games, you have in the back of your head, I got the rifle is going to be good against another guy with a rifle, but you never want to pit a man with a rifle against a tank, where that logic doesn't necessarily apply in a game like StarCraft. That kind of has to teach you over time.
Right, yeah. So because a siege tank, I mean, StarCraft 2 does this concept well, but for example, a siege tank isn't really a tank because you can damage it with small arms fire in the way that you can't in Company of Heroes. So that makes a tank feel more powerful. Yeah,
exactly. And even with infantry, though, the different types of infantry themselves, you think about them differently. Like an MG are nothing functionally like a regular infantry squad. They move slower. They are more prone to. They have to go around some things that a regular infantry squad can just hop over. They themselves are a little slower to move. You have to turn them or back them up. So it's all these little things that both players have to constantly be thinking about instead of, again, sorry, Forge Battalion, but you're a really easy example. With Forge Battalion, you just grab all of your units and throw them in a direction. And I think, you kind of see that with Protoss too, with the Death Ball, that most of the units function reasonably well if you just grab them and throw them in a direction. And you don't really have that as much in Relic's games, excepting Dawn of War 3. I think you see that more, where you can just grab a big blob of units and just move them across the battlefield. But actually, if you don't mind me segueing a little bit, one thing I think Relic was really trying to do with Dawn of War 3, for better or worse, was try to make it a lot clearer. Like, I remember I think it was right after Company of Heroes 2 launched, you had this problem where, and you probably both remember this better than I do, where infantry squads, when they would get attacked, they'd go prone before again, and they actually had to decrease the frequency of that because it was being so abused. Maybe I'm misremembering that, or I'm misstating that.
No, there are some problems with like squad AI in the game where sometimes squad will take fire or something like that, and then the units will go and do their animation of taking cover, and you're like, move over here, and they're just like standing around just being stupid. And it is quite frustrating as a player.
I remember in Dawn of War 2, where, like, if you were Tyranid and you were using Zoanthrope, you'd shoot its artillery attack and it would collide with the ground en route to the target. I really think that a lot of the weirder decisions that we see in Dawn of War 3 were them taking feedback seriously and just not quite implementing it. They were like a step off in implementing it really accurately. So I think a lot of what you see is them saying, let's make this more clear, let's make this more understandable, let's make this easier. There's the real star of the show back there, by the way. But I think that's one of the reasons that you see, like, they all animate at the same time, It's to make it more predictable for the player.
See, I would be cynical and say it's budget reasons. I mean, it's a lot cheaper to make units animate at the same time. I mean, I'm look, I love Relic. I'm wearing a Company of Heroes 2 hoodie. I think actually you are as well, aren't you, Brandon? You have a Company of Heroes shirt.
Yeah, it's a Relic. Yeah, it's
yeah, that's cool.
I think that was one of the Humble Bundle things a couple years ago, and I was like, I have all of the games, but I want the shirt.
Did you play Dawn of War 3 Tightrope, or did you just stay clear of that?
No, I played it when it was free on that beta weekend or something.
Right.
I played quite a lot there, but I didn't play it.
Right.
I thought, maybe I'll pick it up a few months down the line once it's, been patched a little bit. Maybe it'll be fun for mucking around with the boys, but kind of just died off pretty quickly and never really got to that stage,
Yeah, I mean, I don't really buy the whole clarity argument, because the problem with that is, I talked about this in my video review, is that there's so many effects that are just overdone. So, for example, when you, I mean, we're getting really off topic, but that's fine. I mean, I'll never deny an opportunity to criticize Dawn of War 3. So in Dawn of War 2, you would have a squad of 4 TAC Marines. Well, I mean, 4 including a sergeant. And then you would upgrade the plasma gun, and now you have a plasma weapon. So you have 3 bolters in the squad and 1 plasma gun. And then in Dawn of War 1, it was something similar. You have a squad of like 10 or 11, and you can get like up to 4 plasma guns. In Dawn of War 3, when you get a squad of TAC Marines and you upgrade a plasma gun, they all get plasma guns. So if you have 4 squads of TAC Marines, they all have plasma guns. Like, there's just an overwhelming amount of plasma weaponry, and then that it oversaturates the amount of effects. And that was the same thing with like the las cannons. So in Dawn of War 2, when you get a las cannon, it's a squad of 1 guy, a squad of 3, one of which has the las cannon, 2 of them are supporting guys with bolt guns, like the machine guns in Company of Heroes.
Yeah.
In Dawn of War 3, a las cannon is a squad of 3, and they each have their own weapon. So it seems really, really inconsistent for them to talk about clarity, but then to overwhelm players with bright, fuzzy colors from all the plasma guns, from all the las cannons, because they didn't want to actually take these specialized weapons and have them as like a single model.
Yeah, no, I definitely see what you're saying, and mostly I played Eldar because everyone was playing Space Marines.
Well, Eldar was really busted too. At some point.
I had, yeah, there was a time, I think they really toned down dire vendors at some point because there was no reason to build anything else there for a while.
Yeah.
But what was I saying? Anyway, I mostly played Eldar and Orcs, and I didn't really experience that with the squad upgrades, upgrading every member of the squad. I was talking to someone the other day about how much I liked the group dynamics in Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2, because you could take, like with StarCraft, if you give the Space Marine an ability, every Space Marine you produce has that ability all of a sudden, and you have to produce a different type of unit to limit the number of abilities that you're versions of that particular ability that you're introducing. And in Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2, they work around that because you can build all of these, Orca boys or whatever. One of them gets the special upgrade, or you have all the cultists and only one of them gets a grenade launcher. And it is a shame to me. I didn't really never noticed that when you gave the TAC squad an upgrade, the guys got that upgrade. It seems kind of like a misread of the benefit of that system.
Well, and there was also, I mean, like the visual clarity aspect, they just did not do it. I could write a whole essay about why Dawn of War 3 is not visual clarity, and the fact that they marketed it as that is sort of annoying.
I'm not sure about visual clarity so much. I guess what I was talking about mechanical.
Right.
Like,
well, that was a big part of their marketing pitch, though. It's like, oh, that's why we had this art style that no one wanted, the one that looks like League of Legends, because of visual clarity.
I was thinking a lot about like how they changed the descriptions to like expanding circle, and sure, there may have been some like modification there, but I do think a lot of it was like, no. I think that was another pretty common complaint about Flex games is it's not necessarily super clear what the effect of this ability is going to be, because your squad members are different distances apart. I think there was a big thing with Company of Heroes 2 in the beginning with grenades being really inconsistent, where sometimes it would wake the squad, sometimes it would do virtually nothing because it just landed in a weird spot.
Yeah, they scatter in Co-1 and they have a huge AoE.
So I do feel like the critical hit being every 6 hits is more consistent, it's more predictable. A cone or a line or an expanding circle. Stuff does an expanding circle in Dawn of War 3. That seems easier to predict the outcome. Where I think, and I'm not really a professional anymore, but my perception is that a lot of Dawn of War 2 especially, you can't really predict the outcome because shots scatter and you've got a % chance to hit and a % chance to be hit while you're moving, and you have all these % modifiers that can just really go awry, and it's like hedging your bets. Like, I'm going to commit extra guys just in case something bad happens with the G. So from a rules perspective, that's kind of what I perceived. Dawn of War 3 was trying to like limit that sort of feeling.
Right. I think in response to that, I mean, Dawn of War 2 actually has less RNG than Company of Heroes 2. So, for example, there's no penetration. There's no bouncing in that regard. And I don't even think there isn't even an accuracy chance. Like, you always hit. That being said, there is a really, really big case of RNG, though, which is very influential. And that's the special attack chance. So so every melee unit has a chance to do like a special attack which does AoE damage and knocks everyone around them down, and that's determined by melee skill or melee skill. I need to get in the habit of saying, because people always get mad when I say melee. And so certain, like a commander, for example, a force commander has a high melee skill. So when they're in combat against something with a low melee skill, like the Dire Avengers, it will happen very often. But if it's like a force commander versus a Farseer, then it doesn't happen as often. Basically, because of the way that retreat works, is when you're retreating, you take extra damage from melee. So if you can knock everyone around you and then retreat, you're going to have like an extra 500 health that you don't lose from that retreat. I do sort of like what you point out, though, like, because there were a lot of like the elites that had rather MOBA-like abilities in the sense that one in every 5, like every 5th ability does a little bit of extra damage, as opposed to there's like a 20% chance to do extra damage. But I mean that's a very small part of the game.
Yeah, not to go down another rabbit trail, but I do think one thing that was kind of freed RTS designers up a little bit to do is experiment with like skill shots and if this effect is active, then when you use this ability, you get an additional effect. I feel like it didn't originate with the MOBAs, but I feel like they kind of reintroduced that a little bit. I feel like you didn't see a lot of that in RTS design until MOBAs started getting popular again. People were like, oh yeah, we can add a lot of fun skill shots and stuff like League of Legends does.
So why didn't Dawn of War 3 catch your long-term interest, Tyro?
Oh well, I read all the first off, the elites were just way too powerful, right?
Yeah.
You build up an army, and then it just wouldn't even matter because one elite, like your whole army's in strength.
Which, by the way, they're also free. You didn't have to pay for the elites.
Yeah, well. So it just seems so pointless or fruitless, just whatever you were doing up until that point.
Yeah, I think the super elites, in particular, the 8 and 9, like the super heavies, when I played, I always tried to avoid having to use them because it felt like, you had an army, and then all of a sudden this other thing comes in that's just as strong as the army, just about.
Well, the 1v1 meta was you just run the 3 early commanders, because basically if you played a 1v1 match and your opponent didn't have 3 early elites locked in, then you would just kill them because you would have 3 elites and they would have 2 elites, and then they would just lose. So they ended up nerfing the elites globally. Like they did some good changes to it, but it was like when the player base was already dead and just nobody cared. But
there was a little blip last week or the week before when they went sale, but it's kind of dying back down again.
Yeah, but
I think I checked. In fact, I think I checked this morning. Dawn of War 2 had a higher player base.
Well, let's get back on topic though, because there were some things that I wanted to talk about with generals that does this really well. Because there's a lot of ways that you can do this experiential differing. I mean, one of the ways can be cosmetics, so just the way that infantry animates. One of the ways can be gameplay mechanics, which you sort of talked about in terms of like, hey, we can take garrisons with infantry. I think something that's really, really elegant, specifically, is the way that both of the dozers work for China and for USA in generals. So for China, their dozers, the construction dozers, they can't they have like a track, like a tank, rather than wheels. So they can't turn. What they have to do is they move straight, stop, rotate, and then go again. Whereas then the USA dozer actually has wheels, so it can kind of turn like a car. And you think, well, this doesn't really matter. What's the point? But it actually does matter a lot in regards to crushing infantry, specifically crushing the GL8 workers. If a GL8 worker is trying to build a tunnel next to your base, very often you will want to send your dozer out to crush that worker. And so the way that you have to micro the dozers actually varies between both the China and the USA dozers, especially when you're getting in those like really frantic micro battles where the worker's trying to like juke out the dozers so your opponent's micro misses. So I think having ways like that where it controls differently, but in a way that makes sense, not just as some artificially contrived thing, but if you can look at the actual model and go, okay, well, this dozer has wheels, this dozer has tracks, and then how do we convert that into gameplay and interaction and a fun little micro dynamic between two players?
Yeah, that's a really great example, actually. And I was thinking like, why does this matter?
Yeah.
And then when you talked about crushing the workers and especially how that could help stall in defense of like a tunnel, that actually makes a lot of sense. Very cool.
Yeah, and the GLA workers, they can then also take garrisons, and so that'll save them from trucks and dozers that may want to crush them. So say early on in the game, you're building a tunnel, and then a dozer comes along to crush it. You sort of panic, put your worker in the garrison, and all of a sudden now he can't crush the worker. So I think one of the problems that a lot of RTS games do poorly is they have workers or builder units that they don't have any quirks or interaction. They just exist to do one specific purpose, and that's really boring. Whereas if you can give workers additional utility, so for example, the Chinooks in USA, they can actually transport units. And what that does is it quite viscerally it gives you the sense of like this thing is a hauler. It's carrying resources. It can pick up tanks, and with with GLA they can run around. They can build demo traps, which you can sort of use that for different types of utility. You can go in buildings. The dozers can crush. Whereas when you have a lot of worker units, like did you play Battle for Middle Earth 2?
No, as much of a Tolkien buff as I am and an RTS guy, I don't think I played either one of the Battle for Middle Earth.
So that's a really good example because in Battle for Middle Earth 1 didn't have worker units because the base building wasn't done like free building. You had build slots like Halo Wars 2 if you played that, where you would have certain regions that you capture and then you build, and I think that's actually better than having half-assed worker units. Because if you have half-assed worker units that entirely have one purpose to build buildings, it's more complexity and it's just more tedium, and it's just not interesting. And then you can sort of do it with abilities. Like Dawn of War 3 had, your servitors can they can throw down the skull probes, but I think tacking on abilities can be a pretty gimmicky way of doing it. I think if you can naturally give them gameplay mechanics and some sort of form of interaction. So say Company of Heroes, you have, not only do all of your builders repair stuff, they also construct sandbags and tank traps and lay mines and get flamethrowers. They all have this part to play in the game, which is actually meaningful. It feels like, the fact that you can build mines isn't just some tacked on utility for the sake of making pioneers more interesting.
Yeah.
I think Warcraft 3 did a pretty good job of that too. Their workers were quite different.
Yeah,
Some of them, like the Wisps could detonate and destroy spells, or summoned units, or the way that they harvested wood was different.
Mm-hmm.
The movement speeds were different that made some of them better at scout.
Yeah, like I remember how the human ones could turn into militia, but the orc ones could garrison burrows. Yeah. That's interesting because then it also makes the harassment side of it a little bit more interesting, because a lot of harassment in RTS games is very, very linear. It's attack workers, workers die. If workers do not die, no harassment happens. But what can be interesting is sort of like an Age of Empires approach, where just in concept is where you don't have to necessarily kill the workers. You can disrupt their economy by making them garrison structures, making them convert to militia, especially if you have like a fixed cooldown, like you can't unturn them out of militia until a minute passes. But
yeah, I'm a big fan of time-based advantages in RTS, and that's something that Relic does really well, especially with the retreat mechanics. So, you don't lose the units, you don't lose the whole squad. You get that advantage, and you can bring them out back onto the field. But you've got to wait 40 seconds while they heal, add new members, and there's a lot of really interesting decision making around when do I retreat? Do I retreat? Do I take my partially my partially manned squad out to fight because I need to not lose all this territory. And of course, with Company of Heroes and Company of Heroes 2, you get the advantage of, okay, they retreat, and I can take that territory and I gain the benefits over time from that. And I've been watching a lot of Warcraft 3 lately because of Brody, and then the Back to Warcraft channel that's been streaming tournaments and stuff. And that sort of kind of time-based positional, really, you're only really losing a lot if they're much better than you or if you make a big mistake. I actually really prefer that in RTS, where a lot of it's fighting for these positional or temporary advantages that you then have to kind of keep pushing to keep winning. Like in StarCraft, that oftentimes you get that really sharp drop off when, okay, you got a really good, especially in like Zerg versus Zerg. Oh, okay, I can't come back. I quit. And I think it's a lot more interesting, a lot more fun when it's like, okay, and I'm stuck with all my peasants as militia now, and I didn't lose my Archmage, but I had to run away from what he was doing, and they got the kill, they got the experience. I think that's maybe not for a viewer, but as a player and as an ersatz designer anyway, I find that more compelling.
Well, it's also really like something that is not fun is a feeling of helplessness.
Yeah.
If you just feel I'm going to lose a bunch of workers, shit, that really sucks. Whereas even if it's punishing to have your militia peasants turn into militia, at least you're doing something. You're like, oh, okay, I'm in militia now. I'm going to attack him. Yeah, all right, I killed a bunch of stuff. I lost some militia, but I killed some stuff too. That's okay. As long as you feel like you're actually able to do something in response. I think thinking about psychological traps is really important. Feeling like everything is futile and that it's pointless. Like that's when people just uninstall or rage quit, or when they're cheated because they unfairly lost.
Yeah, I think Warcraft 3 did that. Yeah, it was just really good as well with the creeping system. There's like this kind of other objective where you could, creep, you get items for your heroes, you level up your heroes, get a little bit of gold, maybe you take some damage on your army, but that's like another objective on the side of the game instead of just constantly focusing on macro and scouting, build order and fast ticking. It's like a whole nother objective in the game that can.
That's one of the main reasons I'm so terrible at 3. Actually.
It just makes it. It's just a whole nother path of victory in the game.
Yeah, and I know Brandon talked about this in one of his recent articles. Is that the more methods you have to win, the more of a comeback mechanic you have. So, for example, my opponent has a bigger army than me, and he has a bigger economy, but I've been creeping really well, so now, I have level 6 on my mage, so now I can use my ultimate in this next battle. And, Company of Heroes, well, I don't have much map control, I don't have much units, but maybe I can get a VP win. Or, well, at least my squads have more veterancy. So all these little things give you more of a reason to stay in and to be, well, maybe this will get me. And so you always feel like you have one outlet. Well, this could be my path to success, and it means the player who's winning can never become complacent, because there may always be one thing that they fail to maximize over their opponent.
Yeah, and you know, it's a trade-off, right? Because it really sucks to say I was ahead the whole game, and then he came back and sneaked a VP win out from under me. But at the same time, it's like, you know, maybe you kind of rested on your laurels. You're like, I've got my big army, and he's only got 2 tanks left, and then you were out of position, and it came down to 5 VPs, and you didn't take advantage of your bigger army. So yeah, I think as someone who thinks about design, you have to think about kind of the surface area of, like, you know, this sort of outcome is going to happen this often, and this other outcome is going to happen this often, and which outcome is worse overall in the game for the players to experience.
Well, I think you have to also do it incrementally. So the VP system works in Company of Heroes well, because it's 500 to 0 and everything in between. Plus, you also have notifications, like every 100 VPs, and later on it's like, hey, we're running on VPs. So you're never really surprised or caught off guard, which is actually something that happens in Ashes, which can be quite frustrating, is that there's only like a couple of alerts. There's like halfway, and then there's like 3/4, and I think that's it. And just the way that the VPs, they don't like animate as much. Like when the VPs in Company of Heroes reach an increment, like they think something happens where they sort of go larger, because it flashes like 50 VPs on the screen. So you never fail to think about that. Whereas I think also in Age of Empires 2, you can get that, because you have like the wonder victory, and I don't think that's presented as clearly.
I thought there was like a countdown, like a 6-minute countdown or something on this. I don't know. It's been forever since I played Age of Empires 2, but I thought I assumed anyway, there was some sort of visible countdown. Like, hey, you've got this much time left to take them out.
But likewise, with just the point of incremental is, you know, likewise with your heroes, you level up from level 1 to level 10. It's a gradual system, and your opponent, so long as they have ample means of scouting, they can always just like, oh, okay, my opponent's level 7, I'm only level 4, I've got to do something about this. So I think, yeah, you're right that it's double-edged sword, but I think so long as you make it fair and easy to break down and very intuitive, like if your opponent beats you on VPs, it's really, really obvious, because you look at the mini-map, he has 3 VPs, your VPs are ticking down, you know why you're losing. But what is bad, however, is... I mean, once again, to bash my own game, Ashes, one of the problems with Ashes is that the quantum upgrades, there's no visual representation, and there also isn't like, you can't click on them and it doesn't tell you. So in StarCraft 2, there's no visual representation for just the regular engineering by upgrades. But if you click on your opponent's units, it says +3/+3. So if you get creamed in an engagement, you go, oh, okay, he had better upgrades, I had 1/1. Ashes, you don't have that, so you can just lose and be like, why did I lose that engagement? I have no idea. And then at the end of the game, it has like the graphs that shows quanta invested, and you go, oh, he had like triple the quanta invested than me. So I think that's really important, is you can have all these aspects, and that's cool, but you have to present the information to a player. It has to be incremental, which I think really every game does. I can't think of any game that doesn't have like that sort of a system that's not incrementally, like, you know, really big spikes. But yeah, it has to be. It has to feel like it's fair.
But I think a lot of RTS kind of get around that by saying, like, the win condition is just reduce your opponent's ability to back. You know you've lost in most RTS because you literally can't do anything. You know, you come back to it. It's like, well, I don't have any barracks anymore. That's why I kind of think the StarCraft method it's the low-hanging fruit. You know, it's just reduce your opponent to and completely they can't do anything. And a lot of other RTS, like Total Annihilation, they could be way ahead of you, and if you snipe their ACU, you've won. I guess Supreme Commander. I think a lot of RTS kind of build.
Actually, that's a good point. That sniping the commander is a non-incremental win condition. It's just sort of, it's either dead or it's not. And like, yeah, it has health, but generally, like when you're in the late game situation, it just happens so quickly.
Yeah.
And that can be very frustrating.
Well, I think in Supreme Commander, at least some of the commanders could. You had that eject thing where
that was Supreme Commander too, and I did actually like that mechanic. Yeah, as many issues. That was on number 2. No, Forge Alliance didn't have that, but yeah, I thought that was cool because it means that, and you have to rebuild the commander for like a really big cost. Yeah. So it means you don't lose outright, but it gives you sort of a comeback. If you lose your commander, you're punished for it, but it isn't just instantly game over.
Yeah, I do remember Supreme Commander 2, there was a big prevalence of gunship rushes. You'd get a ton of early gunships. You'd get to tier 2 and just get a ton of gunships and go snipe them. They had enough air defenses.
Tier 2, there was no tier 2. There was no tiers in Supreme Commander.
I don't remember how but you'd research them or however.
You researched them. Yeah, it was really weird.
Yeah, because it had a separate interface. You didn't click on a building. You just had that extra
There's a research menu and you unlock new units. And there was like experimentals and stuff, but it wasn't any like teching up. It was just, okay, I've spent. It's sort of like actually the Quanta in Ashes. Like you build a structure, it gives you this third resource called research points or whatever it's called, and then you spend research points unlocking new units, and then you can build the new units. But yes, so, I mean, SOCOM 2 it just lacked the content and it didn't have a lot of depth and variety to it. But yeah, anyway, so back on topic, talking about Kane's Wrath. I think CNC3 is a really good example of this. I think I mentioned this at one point. It may have been before we even started recording. Is that you have like an attack bike. Attack bike is really, really different to a tank. And why is that? So an attack bike, it's super, super fragile, but it's really, really fast. And it has a pretty big turning circle as well. It can't turn on the spot. It also, tanks have rear armor. Tanks can crush infantry. Bikes can't. Bikes can attack aircraft, but they have missiles and stuff. So but then also you have air units that are like the most fast, but they're typically... they're also quite fragile and they're vulnerable to anti-air units only. Infantry, again, you have garrisons. Infantry, you're in squads. That's one way that you can... We didn't even talk about that. In Company of Heroes, infantry and squads, tanks are not. That's a way of making units and tanks feel different.
Yeah. Yeah, and infantry and tanks have a different sort of kind of incremental loss of power. Like every time you lose a model, you're losing DPS on the squad. With a tank, you have the damage states that kind of represent that same sort of incremental loss of functionality. And it's a very different way of experiencing that sort of power slide, I guess, as combat goes on. The tank's weapon gets knocked out, you're like, I'm going to pull it out and repair it so I can get that tank back. It's very different from squad, losing a man.
Yeah, anything to add, Tightrope?
No, not particularly to that.
Well, I think this is an interesting conversation, and that I've been thinking about, because this idea of differing units experientially, it's kind of easy when you think about it in terms of a game like a small scale RTS like StarCraft, Company of Heroes, Command and Conquer. But when it comes to large scale RTS, that's where it gets really hard, and that's something that something in like Supreme Commander and Ashes, because the scale of the battle is so much bigger. You don't have abilities that you can use, like little micro abilities, and you don't really have as many modifiers and many mechanics like garrisons or cover, because the focus of the gameplay is less about the unit control, and it's more about just the overall economic and production management, just the more sort of the global positioning. So how do you then make units feel unique and feel like they're not just all the same, but at the same time not have abilities and such? I think a great example is Supreme Commander. So you take the 4 basic starting units for each faction. You got the the Cybran, the the assault bot. So the assault bot, it has legs, so and it's slightly faster than the other ones too. But just the main thing is the way their weapons work. So the Cyber and assault bot, it fires, like, they all have relatively similar DPS, but the Cyber, and it fires like pew 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 pew. It fires this really quick laser, and then the UEF tank and the Seraphim tank, similar to it, is that it's more like a traditional tank where it fires like about once a second, like bang, bang. And then the Aeon light tank, this is the most unique unit because it has a lot of range and it has a high DPS, but it's really, really fragile. But also it has like a really slow rate of fire with a lot of upfront damage. So even just these little stat differences in terms of the rate of fire, how that applies to like the way that they look, more importantly, when you see them fighting, they look very differently because on one side you have this massive tirade of, pew pew lasers. The other side, it's more about sort of just having these like one-shot high upfront alpha damage. So I think even just simple stat bonuses can make units feel really unique.
I think it's also kind of the experience of that as you expand it out. Like Cyberans, if I recall correctly, they tended to like take a big mass of units and almost run them into the lines of the enemy. It was almost Zerg-like. You take your assault bots and you get them inside your enemy line so they attack all around them. Where the EF, because their shots arced over obstacles, I believe, at least some of
so arcing is the artillery units. Those are separate.
Okay. Well, they're projectiles anyway. I believe they had some advantage for sitting still. So with the EF, you want to get into position and leave your guys there.
I don't know if that's true,
no,
but the cyber thing's definitely right.
I recall with UEF there was an issue for it was very hard to fight with large UEF armies because I think their tracking was too low or projectile speed was too low, and you could actually miss like the first line of enemy combatants. They had big problems with that for. Right. I think it was the projectile speed they ended up increasing. Where like with Aeon, you're trying to keep them at a distance.
Yeah, you're trying to kite backwards. And you need to mix in radar because the attack range is more than the side range. So yeah, it does translate into tactics. Yeah, the Cyber Walkers were a little bit faster. They had really high. They had I think their highest DPS, but it wasn't much. It was more just the fact that they were faster. And they had a little bit less range. Yeah, and so you convert that into micro. But what I'm saying is even without that micro element, like assuming they all have the same range, because the range is the main factor there. Just so long as they all like different cooldowns, different rate of fires, like that makes units feel very different, even if on a gameplay level it doesn't necessarily. But if you can then convert that into like actual tactics and micro, then that's even better. But at the same time, those large-scale RTS games aren't necessarily trying to be about micro.
They could be, though, especially with Supreme Commander in the game. I know oftentimes you get into situations where a couple of tanks would matter.
And like artillery, like focus firing certain things, because artillery had really high damage, but it wouldn't hit moving targets. So if something's stationary, I'll focus that. Hopefully they don't move it. But also then even further than that, so for example, the Aeon light tanks, they could actually hover. They are amphibious. So even if you can't give them combat-oriented quirks, such as, hey, this thing has this ability, you can give it things that are relevant to the wider game. So the fact that Aeon have tier 1 amphibious tanks is like really, really strong. But then the Seraphim have tier 1 amphibious artillery, and then so every faction then has tier 2 amphibious tanks, but then the Aeon amphibious tanks are quite weak in comparison to the others. So they have this strong amphibious early game, but then their mid game amphibious power is a little bit weaker, but then their main battle tanks are really strong. So I think you have to sort of think about what's relevant to the focus of the game. And Supreme Commanders, again, there's a lot of mobility in terms of harassing extractors down and sort of trying to secure forward positions and fortify them. So being able to do so with amphibious tanks early on, especially because the engineers are amphibious, like that makes it makes playing Aeon on small naval maps open up a lot of strategies that aren't otherwise available.
In those types of games, the economy is quite important, right?
Yeah,
So
there's a lot more management
maybe, make differences in the economy. Maybe one resource much more important for that faction, and maybe they have weakness in their harvesting of that resource that is open for exploitation. That is not doesn't translate to the other faction.
That's always something I like to see. And you don't see that very often. I think it's just because it's so hard to implement it fairly, especially on a match-by-match basis. I remember Universe at War had that issue. The Hierarchy faction with the big stompy walker mechs, they could harvest humans and cows off of the maps. And it got them a big burst of resources really quick. And they actually did really poorly on maps that didn't have those, just because of the way their economy scales, kind of binary tiered walker. And the Novus faction, the fast kind of anime robots, they had a more consistent. Well, I mean, they had a Gundam as one of their heroes, so their income's a lot more consistent. They didn't rely on those random spikes. The other faction, they could play a long game because they built a structure that generated resources over time, and it never depleted. So they took a stab at sort of varying resource system. And again, I think it's fascinating because it takes the idea we're talking about these experientially different things, and it ups it a notch. But it's probably harder to balance properly.
Like experientially different economy. Yeah, the map design becomes an issue then if you have multiple resource types, and then like one faction is more reliant on it, then you got to be really careful with map design, and it can be very subtle. So I think going into the territory of resources can be quite dangerous.
I mean, the differences don't have to be so pronounced. They can be very minor. Like Night Elves, for instance, often relied on a lot of wood. Wood harvesting was a bit weak with the wisps. Then you could hide your wisps all over the map because they could harvest wood from anywhere.
No, that's a really great example. Actually.
Yeah, that is interesting.
But then people would quite often harass the wisps to delay the tech because they were very important for picking up and the tech structures.
So the wisps,
but you could go hide them.
They harvest anywhere. They don't need to go back to a
No. They just sat on the tree and generated.
I think that's a cool way of doing economy, because it doesn't necessarily make their wood collecting stronger, although it does, but it does in a way that it changes the way that they do harvest income. So for example, if you were to take Supreme Commander, all the factions generate metal and power in the exact same way. And so if one faction was heavy on power, that would be crappy. But in Warcraft, because you can actually convert that into something that creates more interaction and contention between players, that's kind of interesting. I mean, Zerg is like that, for example, in StarCraft 2, where their worker production is also their military production. So you have the opportunity cost, not only in terms of the raw resource cost, but also in terms of just the timing of the lava. That if you kill a bunch of drones, now if they rebuild the drones, they're going to have a shortfall of unit production. But what the topic that I was going to talk about, Ashes, I think one of the things that Ashes does well in this regard, because while there isn't abilities and so forth, there is the factor that dreadnoughts, which are the tier 3 units, so they're a lot bigger than the other units, a lot more powerful, and they actually have veterancy, so they get experience and they level up to 5 times, and each time they level up, you can select an upgrade for it. So whether that's a new weapon or a defensive upgrade or some little bonus for nearby units or an instant repair. And so it gives you more attachment to these units and makes them more like leaders, because if they're leading an army, then they feel that they may have these auras, but it makes them feel more like they're more important, and they obviously are because they're bigger and more expensive. But the fact that they uniquely have veterancy, but the frigates and the cruisers do not, they're more expendable. That's a nice way of making them experientially different. And then the Juggernauts, which are the tier 4 units, which are even bigger, they, rather than having customization, which is a big part of it, is you can choose, like, do I want this to be a lot of weapons or the auras? Juggernauts, they have no cap to their levels. So you can get like a level 100 Juggernaut, which would like never actually happen in a game. But every time they level up, they, rather than having an ability select, they automatically get a 5% bonus to attack and health. And so it makes them like, oh, well, these are the infinite scalability late game unit.
Yeah.
And that's in a way that doesn't actually have any direct interaction. Like you could argue that, well, the Dreadnoughts are a problem because when you have a really, really big battle, you have to manually click the upgrades, which sort of defeats the big scale of the game. I mean, that you can actually automate the upgrades. So like if you want to, you can select the option that does it for you. But I think that's a cool way of doing experience, which typically in most RTS games, experience is done on everything. In Command and Conquer, in Company of Heroes, everything gets experience. There's not like, well, not only do tanks get experience. The exception there is the British in Company of Heroes 1, only their officers had experience.
Well, one of the things that always kind of appealed to me about Ashes is it has these systems that give you some of the advantages with smaller scale, large scale. Like Quanta, especially in the earlier game, you're constantly kind of making these decisions where you're juggling, like, I mean, usually when you want to spend your is to increase your supply cap, but you get these situations where it's like, man, do I increase my supply cap, or do I take one of these other things I can spend Quanta on? And because you kind of have these bigger linchpin units, you get the feeling of this more tactical, almost squad oriented, because you care more about the supporting unit than it's the army that's around it. So I think that's something that did appeal to me a lot about Ashes was I felt like, I think they came out in kind of similar timescales. Homeworld, Deserts of Karak was a small scale game. It kind of felt like a large scale game. You had this constant production, this constant churn of these light units, and then Ashes was a large scale game that felt like it had elements of a smaller scale game with the quantum management and the fewer heavy hitter units. I mean, I guess analogous in some ways to the experimentals from Supreme Commander.
Well, Deserts of Karak, you didn't have abilities, did you? Or did you?
Units do actually have ability.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, the carrier does too. It gets a rocket barrage.
Right.
But it just felt like Deserts of Karak. I really, really enjoyed all my time with Deserts of Karak. But it kind of made me think a lot about because Deserts of Karak is very much along and Homeworld too. Like mechanical systems are pretty similar in ways. And it really kind of made me appreciate the turn like took with Dawn of War, with this bringing it to squad-based production. Deserts of Karak really felt like, to me, like a race to get the biggest army, because once you could overpower your opponent basically had one or two, maybe three units that could produce other units. So if you lost an early fight definitively, you would just lose the game.
Yeah,
there was no way to produce to come back. It was kind of like Zerg versus Zerg. Every match was like a series.
The anti-snowball. Yeah, I mean, anti-snowball is like I think a really important topic to talk about. Yeah, and so I think big RTS games can have that issue if the maps are small. Now, Supreme Commander kind of gets around this by having the commander. So, and not only just the commander, but also the fact that you can reclaim. Being able to reclaim softens that snowball. But the map size is like a pretty natural like a anti-snowball mechanic, which I think most of the Deserts Karak multiplayer maps were pretty small, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So playing Ashes on small maps isn't very fun, but playing it on big maps is a lot better. And the reason why is because if you're playing on a small map and you take one bad engagement, your opponent can pretty much just then push towards your base, either just camp your production or like try and cut you off, or just take out most of your income and you lose. But when you're playing on a bigger map, what happens is that if you take a bad engagement, so long as it's somewhat central on the map, by the time they actually push through towards your base, you've already reconsolidated. You've already thrown down some defenses. You've kind of built another little army to contest it, and then you naturally have that defender's advantage where, if they go back and regroup, it's going to take them ages, and by the time you're going to have something else to buffer. And also the way that like static defense works. So for example, you're going to have a really, really good army, but if your opponent was able to pick off all of your artillery cruisers, then you can't actually push into their base. Or if you do so, it'll be really hard because of the static defense will punish you. Same with like anti-air. If you pick off all the anti-air, then maybe you can swoop in with some bombers. So
Yeah.
I think if you get a game that doesn't have a lot of anti-snowball mechanics and pit it on a small map, then it's difficult. So StarCraft naturally has that with the high ground and the choke points, is that it's really hard to close a game out if you have an advantage because of the way that you have that ramp in your main base, and even the natural base is still like a really well defended location with you sort of create your own choke points with the base building. And then you have like a lot of other games do it just by having a more natural bigger armies don't scale linearly. So because of the way that you have to actually micro and position all your units, using 6 units isn't as effective as 3 units, especially in something like Command & Conquer where the micro is a bit finicky. And in Company of Heroes, you have mechanics like suppression or AoE or cover.
Well, and to bring it back to the experiential different units thing, that's one of the reasons I think it's so important to think about, because like you said, it doesn't necessarily scale linearly, but sometimes you get this situation where DPS does, and then it just comes down to who's got more DPS on the side. In the situation like Company of Heroes, one player can have more DPS. You could have tons of shock troops or penal battalions, and then the other guy has 2 or 3 MGs, and all of a sudden that DPS doesn't necessarily matter anymore. And I think that's one of the things that is so important to think about with RTSs, how to make the mental equations that you're having to do, basically is what it is. Having these mental equations be complex, not just I'm going to put the most DPS in the fight and I win, but maybe I don't have as much damage out there from purely a shooting perspective, but I've got infestors and I can lock some of your army down. From StarCraft, the original StarCraft, and Arbiter. Oh, half your army's gone. Yeah. Temporary. And then it doesn't matter that you've got then. And I think that's why that's one of the core reasons why having units that feel different and do different things is so important, because it makes those things you're asking the player to do more.
So what would you do to take a game like Ashes and make it vary more experientially?
That's a good question. So yeah, you're putting me in a bit of a disadvantage because since I played, I loaded it up today, but I didn't have a chance to actually get any skirmishes in or anything. I think some of it comes down to giving the player direct moment-by-moment control over certain outcomes. So in StarCraft, that's active use. That's infestors being able to temporarily take control of Colossi. Or I remember in Bronze League, I sometimes I'd win by taking my colossi and hallucinating a bunch of them, so it looked like 50 of them. And I just walk them into the base and they didn't have any detection. They're like, oh no, he's got 50 colossi, I quit. Of course that doesn't really happen a lot on the high end of play. I think I saw Idro rage quit once because of some
that happened. Yeah, that was a
that's but in a game of the scale of Ashes of the Singular, I think something that can work given proper balance is like the off map or the support. And I think you see that in Command & Conquer 3, where you have these support powers that don't win you the battle per se. They give you extra information. They do slight disruptions. They kind of change the outcome. They change the course of the battle slightly, just enough to tip it in your favor for a win. And because it's not, I'm going to nuke your entire army.
Well, in Kane's Wrath, in Kane's Wrath,
it can.
There's a whole bunch of those, like Vein Detonation. There's all kinds of.
Yeah, but there's also some of the earlier ones that you get the lower power.
Yeah.
That like the Skrin one that puts down the repair drones. That's a good example.
Yeah.
That's not going to necessarily win the fight, but use it at the right time in the right context, it can really change a loss into a win, or a win into a more definitive win, loss into a less severe loss. And giving the player that second by second control over their fate, being able to jump in at just the right time with that extra little nudge in their favor. Because I think it's very easy in RTS to have it come down to the numbers are on my side. My income is better. My DPS is better. My is slightly better. And it can feel really crappy to lose that. Man, if I had 5% more.
Wouldn't it feel crappier to lose because someone threw down an ability and blew a bunch of your stuff up? There's actually a problem that we had recently, as in like over a while, is that orbital abilities were too powerful, so we had to tone back a lot of them, like in particular the late game ones.
Which is why I think you never really saw Blizzard take that approach. It's always been tied to a unit, so you've got a range on it of 13 units from my High Templar. So that way you can say, oh, he's got High Templar. I know how to stop this. I know how to react to it. With an off-map ability, you have to basically rely on using telegraph it.
Yeah.
Which can be harder. I think it can work. Like you could drop a beacon, and the beacon would execute the ability. So you'd be able to see the beacon and either move away from it or kill it and cancel the ability. So I think there's ways to do it. Or tie it to some sort of installation mobile unit, so you're still activating it basically from your user interface instead of having to select something, but there's still some sort of local presence,
right?
Or a dispel, some sort of like, I see they're going to drop something, and I put a zone of denial down, and their off map just doesn't function when it hits the zone. So it feels really crappy. I play Clash Royale on my phone, and yeah, it's a pay to win mobile game, whatever. But the strategy comes not just from placing units, but from timing the abilities. And the worst feeling in that game is when everything's lining up your way, and then someone drops a fireball and the army's half dead. And it's supposed to be this kind of interplay of not showing your hand and timing and countering what your opponent's doing. And for a phone game, it actually works decently well. But what it doesn't do well is give players the ability to react to the reaction. So it's not like a fencing match. It's I punch you, you punch me.
Yeah.
And eventually one of us, Rock'em Sock'em Robots, one of our heads pops up. Where I think a real RTS, a real strategy game can excel in that is we have our armies engaging. I line up a bombing run, or some sort of pseudo off map where you can shoot my planes down. It's got the ion cannon drops a homing beacon before it fires, and you can kill the homing beacon, and then it doesn't do anything. Like I said, some sort of temporary area of effect silence. So you can have real counterplay where I do something, you stop it, and then I try to stop whatever you put down to stop my ability. You can have more layers in a real strategy game than you can in a Android, iOS, pseudo strategy placement game. But I think the key is, like we said earlier, is not feeling like you don't have an option. And it's on whoever's implementing these options to give you the power to do that. And that's, to say it lightly, that's non-trivial. That's where the challenge comes in.
Yeah, I mean, Company of Heroes does that with the off maps, like the red smoke. But I mean, one of the recent changes that's happened in Company of Heroes 2, which I'm a big fan of, is the Fallschirmjägers. You used to just click them on a building and they would immediately deploy, and then you get like a whole squad in your the back of your opponent's army line, and you would just kill a squad on retreat. Where now they parachute down, so they have, like, they're vulnerable while they're landing. There's a delay, so you can see it coming. You can reposition. Having the ability to see what's coming and respond makes it less frustrating when it does stuff.
Yeah, and less binary too. That's in pretty much all of the airstrikes work that way, right? You can use AA like half tracks and stuff to attack the airplanes and potentially shoot them down. Is that?
Yeah. Some, like most bombing runs and stuff, they're going to get guaranteed hit every time. But the loiter planes that fly around for multiple passes, you can shoot those down, and they're often extremely powerful. You do want to do that.
Yeah, aka the skill planes. The issue with that, though, in Company of Heroes is it isn't done well. It's all RNG. Whereas what's possible and what Mirage Flask did in his mod like years ago that Relic didn't want to implement is where every plane has a fixed amount of health and armor, and every anti-air weapon has a fixed amount of damage and penetration, so then there's no RNG involved. Because the problem in Code 2 is that, like, a scout car, the 222 has just as much anti-air as an Ostwind, which is ridiculous. Right. It's an anti-air tank. Why does the scout car have as much anti-air as the Ostwind? But I feel like you sort of dodged the question there, because I asked you, like, how do we make units feel more experiential in a game like Ashes? And you're like, oh, just abilities, just orbitals and off maps.
Well, like I said, I'm the disadvantage talking about Ashes specifically.
It's a Supreme Commander. I mean, I've mentioned good examples, but just like in a bigger scale RTS, like what's some examples of ways that you can make it more experiential? Well,
I mean, let's talk about what Supreme Commander did. The experimental units are very experientially different from each other. You've got the Tsar, which is a giant flying air factory, and the UEF have the Fat Boy, which is a ground-based factory, but there's no real easy line of comparison. The Tsar is hugely expensive, and it's flying a lot of different weapons on it. We talked about kind of Supreme Commander's stat-based differentiality and how that actually works for them, for the most part. So I think Supreme Commander with kind of picking these very different kind of archetypes for what their experimental did was what they did to make them experientially different.
To actually expand on your point there. So the Fat Boy is quite unique, and it's more like an experimental artillery unit. In fact, that it outranges everything, but it's pretty weak stat-wise. Where then the Aeon, the Galactic Colossus, is like pretty short range, but it's really powerful, and that's the same with the I think with the Seraphim one. Yeah, so basically just the stat differences is sort of what you're getting at is stat.
Well, and also archetypal differences, like you said, you got the Monkey Lord, the Galactic Colossus, and the Fat Boy. They're all kind of the same quote unquote parallel in tier 4, but they're all very, very different. You don't use them the same way. You don't think about them the same way. They cost dramatically different amounts of resources to even purchase. I think the Fat Boy is like probably 2 or 3 for a Galactic Colossus, but those are even the closest analogs. With the Aeon Illuminate, they had a really, really, really expensive one that basically gave you infinite resources.
Yeah.
So and maybe that's part of the answer is you have the archetypes in Supreme Commander, and they don't give each faction the same archetypes in experimentals. Gosh, what was that cyber one, the gunship that looked like a beetle? Like there was nothing like that. The Soul Ripper, yeah. There was nothing else like that in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, I think with late game units, it's a lot easier to do that. Like I think the Juggernauts and Ashes are rather unique. Every Juggernaut's different, and there isn't necessarily an equivalent. So like the Leonidas for PHC, like really long range, and it has heaps of single target damage, and then it has like little secondary weapons. But then the Eye of Darkness, which is like the Substrate equivalent, it has splash damage, so it's really good versus just general ground armies. But it isn't as good in dueling like the other Juggernauts directly because it doesn't have as much range and firepower. But I think when it comes to your line units, like your tier 2 tank, your tier 2 artillery, that's where it gets more difficult because you can't have those differences as pronounced.
Yeah, I think that kind of comes down to giving the players differences that mean something to them. Like with the Post-Human Coalition, they have armor in some of their units that decreases incoming damage, where the Substrate has force fields. And,
not anymore. That's sort of been reworked.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
that was a really bad system.
You see how out of touch, out of date I am.
Yeah.
But they used to, and in a second by second situation, that doesn't really feel very different, especially at the scale. Like I think the armor was a great idea, but you didn't really notice it as much because you're dealing with not 2 or 3 tanks like in Company of Heroes, but 20 or 30. And it's harder to keep track of, how armor is impacting that. But yeah, I'm sorry for my out of date.
Oh, that's right. So with the armor, I mean, that's an interesting conversation too, because the thing is the problem is that when PHC had armor, which is like a damage reduction, and Substrate didn't, it meant that the counter systems in regards to like armor piercing was really inconsistent. So basically the units that you would use to counter cruisers against Substrate was also the same units that you would use to counter their dreadnoughts. Whereas against PHC, because their dreadnoughts have a lot of armor, where the cruisers have only a little bit of armor, it means that you actually want to invest in armor-piercing units, like the Nemesis and the Eradicators. So by standardizing the armor rates between PHC and Substrate, it actually meant there was a lot more complexity in terms of unit composition, because it meant that rather than just spamming Athenas all game long, which are sort of like the main cruiser-destroyer, you got to think, okay, well, I got to start mixing in some Nemesis cruisers because he may have a Dreadnought coming up soon, and I want to make sure I have some armor piercing. So,
yeah, but I mean that's kind of what I'm trying to get at is that there are differences, but the differences have to mean something to the gameplay. Like what you said with generals is that the treads versus the wheels, that seems like such a minor difference, but it actually impacted the gameplay. And I think that's kind of a trial and error thing, especially when you're talking about scaling something up from 1 or 2 units to hundreds.
So for the grander scale, perhaps units have to be more similar at the start of the game, because otherwise maybe a bit more of a rock paper scissors, and you might just have like super short matches where I got rock, you got scissors.
Hey, did you play?
I smash you straight away. But then in the other games where are more micro-intensive, you can control the units more finely. You can make up for those different. So you don't have complete stomps from large stat different units.
Yeah, Andrew,
in the early game.
Did you play Ancestors Legacy?
Oh, I tried, but it just didn't work on the computer. Something with graphics just didn't work.
Oh, that's a shame.
It ran awful.
Because what you said it was like perfect a summary of that game is that so that there's like 4 types of units. You have like an archer, pikeman, shield, and axeman, or something like that. And there's like a counter system between them. And each starting faction has a different starting unit. So like, this faction gets the archers. This faction gets the shield guys. This faction gets pikemen. And so there's like a lot of rock, paper, scissors in which faction versus which faction in the early game. And it's really dumb.
Yeah, that's a really bad way of doing things. I think Warcraft 3 managed that quite well. You know, elves had archers to start, which were, you know, very fragile but range, pretty high damage. However, you know, orcs had grunts, which were very high health. You know, you have to get in close range, they're more expensive. So yeah, they managed a good balance in that game. But as I said, there was a lot more room for control, especially with heroes.
I legitimately love how often this conversation has come back. Well, Warcraft 3 was a really good game.
More than one of them.
They nailed it. They did.
They really did. I mean, they did.
Well, I think in for that example, I think the crucial part of it is that the other ground unit is really accessible. So the huntresses and the spearmen, you can build those all early on. So they're not locked behind a tier 2. The tier 2 is for like spellcasters and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you get tech structure to unlock.
Yeah, but it wasn't much of an unlock though, was it? It was just like an armory or something.
No, I mean, yeah, most cases you'll get that on your way up. So it didn't really impede you.
I think another thing that also helped was an early frontal assault. Warcraft 3 was not. It was a really risky proposition, and it was a lot more common to spend the early game trying to get experience and money and items, and then only really engaging with a significant force once you have a decent sized army built up. So it doesn't matter quite as much the first unit you have necessarily. It gives you a little bit of a different feel to the early game, but you're mostly fighting with small cadre of units as opposed to just 1 or 2 or some archers versus groups of grunts. So
yeah, I think Company of Heroes 2 does it well in that all of this of like the basic infantry, they're all riflemen. Like it would be kind of weird if like one faction had, say, assault grenadiers as their starting unit, because that would just have a really one-dimensional interaction where it's just.
Well, the OKW had that issue for a long time.
I mean, sort of, yeah.
Their starting unit was such a different take than everyone else's. I seem to recall a lot of issues with how that impacted the early game.
Do you want to answer that, Tightrope?
Yeah, the problem was the unit was just too versatile. You could just make false grenadiers, right? You could just make five of them, and then in the early game they'd kind of be, you know, they weren't the strongest unit at the time, raw, but it didn't really matter that much. And then as you transition to the mid and late game, obviously they're quite strong with their variancy, which at the time was very strong as well. But then they get the anti-tank, so then they're kind of like anti-tank, anti-infantry. They weren't that expensive to reinforce either. They're just anti-everything almost, and you just run around, and it's just, get like maybe chuck one late game unit in that blob, and you just run around the map and defeat everything.
Yeah,
quite repetitive.
I mean, the Stern Pioneers, though, when I meant like starting unit, like, yeah, the starting unit Stern Pioneers, I meant more like the main combat unit. Because you actually would generally, we would go Volksgrenadiers rather than Sturm. So all of they're all rifle infantry. I mean, the Stern Pioneers, I think actually more of the reason why they were overpowered is because of their synergy with the Kubelwagen. When that would come out and that was suppressing stuff, that was really obnoxious. Just having such early access to a mobile suppression platform that doesn't have to be reinforced and can be repaired for pretty much free. That was pretty obnoxious. But yeah, we can wrap it up here. It's been an hour and a half. That's a good length. I think having a consistent length is a good way to sort of make it a more consistent podcast rather than like, oh, it's an hour today, 2 hours next time. But yeah, thanks for chatting, guys. It's been fun. I guess apologies to Tightrope that we sort of went off on all these tangents that you were like, oh, I haven't played this game.
Yeah, there are a few games that I'm not too familiar with, but that's all right.
Yeah. All right.
Well, no, thank you so much for having me. I had a great time. I hope we can do this again sometime soon in the future, assuming I wasn't too obnoxious or.
No, it was great. Yeah, I think I learned a lot.
Yeah,
you have strong opinions about things, which is good.
I'm not sure if that's good or not, but thank you, I guess. No, I'd love to do this again sometime soon.
For sure.
So, thank you.
And I have everyone's Twitter handles here on the screen, so follow these guys on Twitter if you haven't. And thanks for watching.